Trevor Nash had never been the kind of man who needed anyone's approval. At 52, he had earned the right to live life on his own terms, far removed from the ever-churning machinery of suburban politics and petty social codes. He had no interest in wine tastings, charity galas, or dinner parties where people pretended to be civil while calculating one another's property values. That entire world belonged to a different class of people, one Trevor had spent his life avoiding. Instead, he chose the isolation of a rugged Arizona ranch, where the sunsets bled orange across the desert horizon, and silence wasn't just an absence of noise, it was a presence in itself. He had bought the land 15 years ago, back when the nearest neighbors were a 15-minute drive down a dirt road. Back then, it had been a stretch of neglected acreage, dotted with overgrown mesquite and rusted fencing. The bones of a small house stood crumbling in the center, half swallowed by desert ivy and the weight of time. Where others had seen ruin, Trevor saw refuge. He spent years rebuilding the structure by hand. No hired labor, no blueprints, just intuition, sweat, and a reverence for durability. He poured concrete in triple-layered slabs, reinforced the foundation with salvaged steel, and restored the roof using recycled Spanish tiles that had once belonged to a collapsed mission in Santa Cruz. When it was finished, it wasn't pretty by modern standards, but it was solid, self-sufficient, and his. Aside from his modest but heavily fortified home, Trevor had slowly expanded the property into a hybrid workspace and sanctuary. One section was dedicated to cultivating rare cactus varieties, another to storage of salvaged diesel machinery, mostly military-grade equipment he'd acquired at auctions over the years. He didn't keep the machines for show. He restored them. Not for resale, either. For the art of it. That's what people didn't understand. Some men painted, some carved wood. Trevor rebuilt monsters of steel and torque and turned them into functional, breathing relics. Among them was his crown jewel, an armored personnel carrier, old and temperamental, with layers of chipped Soviet paint beneath its worn, sand-colored shell. The engine roared like a beast from another era, and Trevor loved it like a dog with scars. For years he lived undisturbed, a ghost on the edge of the grid. Mail came once a week. Cell signal barely existed. He paid his taxes, minded his business, and kept to himself. But over time, the world started creeping back in. It started slowly, with new roads being cut through the hills west of his property. At first, they were unpaved surveyor tracks. Then came the utility trucks, followed by the graders and developers. One summer, a sign appeared at the end of the Ridge Road, Vista Rosa Estates, luxury vineyard living. Trevor drove past it without stopping, without reacting. It was just another name for another dream someone else had cooked up. He'd seen 100 like it, but this one, it turned out, had teeth. Within 2 years, the ridge across from Trevor's property was lined with glimmering glass homes, sterile modern builds surrounded by manicured vineyards and artificial rock walls. The people who moved in weren't farmers. They were weekend sommeliers, Instagram retirees, couples who spoke in words like exclusivity, sustainable opulence, and curated lifestyle. Trevor, of course, didn't care until one of those residents decided to. Her name was Karen Westbrook. He met her in passing during a county zoning meeting, one of those rare times he drove into town to file a protest about an irrigation project that threatened to reroute runoff through his south field. She was hard to miss. Everything about her was calculated. Platinum hair, tight blazer, lips like glass. She introduced herself before he could avoid her, smiling too widely, her voice coated with the kind of sweetness that never meant what it said. "Oh, you must be the gentleman with the tanks." The word tanks rolled off her tongue like an accusation. Trevor replied flatly, "Armored carriers. Restorations." "Well," she said, eyes darting to someone over his shoulder, "they're certainly noticeable." He said nothing. She moved on. That encounter might have meant nothing, if not for the following months, which brought a steady parade of small intrusive gestures. First, he found that his access road was being used by vineyard delivery trucks without permission. Then came the complaints, initially informal, then filtered through county inspectors. Noise ordinances, visual impact reports, even a report that a military vehicle was spotted moving dangerously close to a shared property line. Trevor wasn't naive. He knew what was happening. Karen wasn't just another annoying neighbor. She was a manipulator with influence and a taste for slow, suffocating control. And Trevor, by the very nature of his presence, was a stain she couldn't tolerate. He tried to remain diplomatic. He put up signs, installed extra fencing, sent polite notices to the estate management asking them to redirect their vehicles. But nothing changed. Every small act of defense was met with another escalation. Wine-tasting buses turning around on his land, landscapers dumping clippings over his boundary fence, and, most recently, a concrete signpost drilled into the edge of his drive, reading, Vista Rosa Scenic Exit. It wasn't just invasion. It was psychological warfare with a luxury brand stamp. Then came the morning when Trevor found the white Lamborghini. It was parked perpendicular across his main gate, blocking the only direct exit to the road. Its tires were turned inward, like a resting animal curled protectively around its territory. The windshield had no permit, no note of apology, no indication it was there by accident. Taped under the driver's wiper was a single card. On it, embossed in gold cursive, were the words, "Some views don't belong in the landscape." Trevor stared at the car for a long time, arms crossed, jaw set. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back toward the barn. The silence that had once been his sanctuary now hummed with tension. He wasn't angry in the way people often are. He wasn't shouting or pacing or kicking gravel. He was beyond anger. What he felt was colder, tighter, the kind of clarity that comes when a man finally understands he's been chosen, deliberately, as someone's enemy. He didn't call the police, not because he didn't believe they'd help, but because he knew exactly how they'd respond. He'd seen it before. Wealth and influence changed the tone of every conversation. There would be nodding, maybe a report filed, but no tow truck would dare touch a luxury vehicle without explicit permission. The entire system was too afraid to leave a scratch. But Trevor wasn't. What made Trevor different wasn't the tools he had, or the weapons, or even the temper that others suspected simmered beneath his quiet surface. It was patience. Method. He knew the difference between acting and reacting. He wouldn't be goaded, not on their terms. If there was going to be a response, it would be his, and it would be final. And so, while the morning sun warmed the roof of his barn, Trevor began preparing. Not for war, for resolution. Trevor didn't rush. That was the first rule he lived by, the one thing he had learned the hard way in his earlier years. Never act in haste, especially when someone is trying to provoke you into a mistake. So instead of giving in to the obvious bait that now lay like a smug, white tombstone across his front gate, he walked calmly back to the house, poured himself a coffee and sat on the back porch, watching the desert wake up under a slow, unforgiving soon. The silence was thin, stretched, punctuated by the metallic chirp of crickets and the distant thud of a tractor from some other parcel of land miles away. Trevor leaned back in the creaking chair, the laminated card from the Lamborghini now resting in his lap, and considered what this move actually meant. This wasn't about aesthetics anymore. This was about control. Someone had decided to make an example out of him, to draw a line and dare him to cross it. But Trevor wasn't interested in performative retaliation. He wanted permanence. And so, before doing anything else, he went inside and opened the drawer of his desk, pulled out a well-maintained folder marked Property Lines and Easement Maps, and began scanning the details. He already knew them by heart. His land stretched to the edge of the old arroyo that predated every modern development in the area. The gate, the road, the gravel path, all legally his. No part of it belonged to the adjacent estates, and no one had any right to block it. Still, legal right and practical enforcement were two different things in places like this, where private property bumped up against manufactured neighborhoods full of people who thought fencing meant ownership, and silence meant consent. He had called the sheriff's office once before, when the first surveyor trucks had rolled onto his land without permission, and while the deputy had been polite, the message was clear. Don't expect quick resolutions when the people on the other side. Wear expensive shoes and host fundraising events. Trevor had no intention of calling again. This wasn't going to be solved by paperwork and promises. Later that morning, he took photographs of the vehicle from every angle, capturing the license plate, the tire marks on his gravel, even the embossed note on the windshield. Then he went to his garage and pulled out a simple whiteboard, writing the date, time, and location details in bold black marker, propping it against a ladder and taking a few more photos with the board in frame for verification. After that, he opened his laptop and sent everything to Monica Velasquez, his lawyer, along with a short message. Another escalation. Vehicle blocking gate. No driver in sight. Advise on next step. He didn't wait for her response. He already knew what it would be. Document everything, don't touch the vehicle, avoid confrontation, and let the legal process work. That was sound advice for someone with time, money, and a reputation to protect. Trevor had none of those luxuries. What he did have was a schedule to keep, shipments to receive, and a property to run. And as he walked back outside and stared again at the Lamborghini, its sleek curves and absurdly low clearance gleaming in the noon sun, he realized just how much contempt had gone into this act. This wasn't some drunk mistake or logistical error. This was precision. It was a message from someone who believed rules didn't apply to them and who knew full well how long it would take to remove such a vehicle without causing damage. Around 1 p.m., a tow truck finally showed up, one Trevor had called through a third-party contractor, avoiding the companies known to service the vineyard estates. The driver was young, polite, but visibly uncomfortable. He circled the car once, scratched the back of his head, and then walked over to Trevor, holding a clipboard. "Sir, I just want to be up front with you," the man said. "My boss called me 5 minutes ago. Said if this is a Vista Rosa property issue, we're not to touch the car without written consent." Trevor didn't flinch. "It's not Vista Rosa property. It's mine. You can see the lines on that post," he said, pointing to the faded but intact boundary marker that predated the estates by 2 decades. "Vehicle is parked on private land, blocking legal access. You're within your rights to remove it." The driver looked uneasy. "Yeah, I get that. But I'm being told it's a high-risk tow. If something goes wrong, we're liable. This is a $250,000 car, man." Trevor didn't say anything at first. Then he turned, walked to his porch, and picked up the laminated card. He returned, handed it to the driver, and said, "Read this." The man scanned it, then looked up. "Wow, that's something." Trevor nodded. "If you won't move it, I understand. But I'm done waiting. I've got work to do. Appreciate you coming out." He handed the man a $50 bill, thanked him, and watched as the truck disappeared down the road, the dust from its tires lingering like a final insult. By the time the sun had begun its slow descent, stretching shadows across the red soil and jagged fence posts, Trevor had made up his mind. Not in anger, not in spite, but in principle. He went to the barn, uncovered the armored carrier, and began his checks. Oil, coolant, battery. He moved with the ease of a man who'd done this 100 times, not with enthusiasm but with the solemnity of ritual. By the time the engine growled to life, shaking the loose nails in the rafters, Trevor was already in motion, the gate ahead glowing gold in the sunset, the Lamborghini still parked like an alabaster ornament at the edge of his patience. He didn't floor it. He didn't even speed. He maneuvered slowly, carefully, easing the massive vehicle forward until its treads kissed the edge of the exotic car's hood. There was a pause, like a breath held between worlds, and then the steel met fiberglass, and the silence broke. The sound was ugly, cracking, splintering, screaming metal and popping glass. The Lamborghini's body folded under the pressure like tin foil. The tires burst, the chassis collapsed, and the windshield spiderwebbed in a single, perfect moment of failure. Trevor didn't stop until the treads had passed clean over the remains and touched gravel again. Then he reversed, parked, shut off the engine, and climbed down without a word. He didn't feel triumphant. He wasn't smiling. This wasn't some viral moment or cinematic revenge fantasy. It was necessity. He had been blocked, so he cleared the path. Nothing more, nothing less. That night, he sent Monica the photos, including one of the crushed car and the tank, now resting in the barn with dust settling around its wheels. Her reply came quickly. It was a single line. "We need to talk." The following morning brought exactly what he expected: police cars, county vehicles, and a shrill voice shouting his name from the other side of the fence. Karen had arrived. She was dressed in all white as though attending a protest in her own honor. Her face was a mask of rage, panic, and performative injury. She stood behind the sheriff's deputy and pointed at the remains of the car like a Roman senator ordering execution. Trevor, standing calmly on his porch with his arms folded, simply watched. "He's a maniac," she was saying. "This was a calculated act of violence. I feared for my life. That thing," she pointed now at the barn, "is a weapon of war." The deputy held up a hand, trying to de-escalate. "Ma'am, we're treating this as a civil property dispute. No one was in the vehicle at the time of the incident, and the owner of the land has surveillance footage verifying the car was parked without consent." Karen turned to Trevor, her eyes blazing. "You're finished here," she hissed, the performative tone slipping for just a second. "This is going to court. You think this is over?" Trevor didn't respond. He simply stepped down from the porch, handed the deputy a printed copy of his easement map and photographs, and said, "If they want to press charges, I'll be at home. Let me know when the legal system catches up with reality." As the sheriff took the papers and nodded, Karen stepped back, shaking with indignation. Behind her, a man in a tailored jacket was already on the phone, probably her lawyer, or PR handler, or both. Trevor turned and walked back inside. He had made his move. Now it was their turn. The days that followed were not quiet, though Trevor had known they wouldn't be. After the tank rolled over the Lamborghini and the dust settled, a different kind of noise began. Less mechanical, more strategic, and infinitely more insidious. He expected anger from Karen, expected drama and accusations. What he didn't expect was the precision with which her response unfolded. It started with the arrival of certified letters. 3 of them arrived within 48 hours, hand-delivered by a courier dressed like someone who worked corporate security for a luxury hotel. The first was a civil suit filed on behalf of Karen Westbrook, alleging property damage, emotional distress, and malicious endangerment. The second was a letter from a private mediation firm proposing an out-of-court settlement, and the third was a formal complaint to the County Zoning Commission accusing Trevor of operating heavy industrial machinery on residential agricultural land. That last one was the one that made him laugh, just once, bitter and low, as he scanned the wording. Trevor had seen enough in his life to know when someone wasn't just angry. They were playing the long game. He brought the documents to Monica the next day. They met at her small downtown office, tucked above a CPA firm and lined with tall, dusty windows that overlooked the courthouse parking lot. Monica didn't say much at first, just read in silence, tapping a pen against her thumbnail. When she finally looked up, her expression wasn't one of panic. It was focus, calculated and taut. She slid the zoning complaint to the side. That one's nonsense. The county knows your land is zoned mixed use under the old statute. They'd have to challenge the original classification, which would require a full hearing, environmental review, and a lot more leverage than she's got. Then she tapped the civil complaint. This one's trickier. Not because she's right, but because perception sells. She's got a damaged car, a dramatic narrative, and money to throw at it. Judges hate noise. They like clean paperwork and boring people. We're not going to give her fireworks. We're going to give her suffocation by fact. Trevor nodded once. He respected Monica's approach. No theatrics, just results. He returned to the ranch with instructions. No further contact with Karen or anyone representing her. Document everything. Install a second round of perimeter signage. Keep logs of all activity. Visitors, vehicles, even attempted deliveries. It was a bureaucratic shield, and it made sense. But it didn't stop the next phase of Karen's campaign. Within days, the boundary of Trevor's land had become the site of a sudden influx of accidental trespassers. One afternoon, a landscaping truck drove 10 feet onto his gravel path, claiming they were lost on their way to Parcel 16. Trevor didn't say a word, just took a photo of the truck, noted the time, and watched as they slowly reversed out. The next morning, a small group of cyclists came rolling up his main drive, snapping photos of his barn, before pretending they had missed a turn on their wine tour map. Trevor recognized one of them from a photo on the estate's Welcome Center website, Karen's event planner. He didn't confront them. He just filed the images away. But the most brazen incident happened 4 days after the initial lawsuit. That morning, Trevor awoke to find a large, decorative trellis had been installed across the eastern fence line, just outside his boundary, but with a protruding arch that extended 3 feet over his land. The structure bore the words Vista Rosa Vineyard Walk in stylized script, flanked by painted wooden grapes and faux vines. At first, Trevor thought it was a prank. Then he saw the small marker plaque at the base. Phase 2, Scenic Route Expansion, in coordination with local stakeholders. That was the moment it clicked. This wasn't about the Lamborghini. This wasn't about the tank. Karen was using the incident as leverage to justify a broader move, to build a legal and visual argument that Trevor's land, or at least part of it, was interfering with the community's future development. He called Monica immediately and sent photos. Her response came swiftly. File a cease and desist, report the encroachment, and begin assembling affidavits to establish the historical independence of the land. That afternoon, Trevor walked the eastern perimeter and marked every pole, every bolt, every visible edge of the trellis with orange construction paint. It wasn't vandalism, it was evidence tagging. Then he printed large signs reading, "Unauthorized structure, subject to removal under private easement law," and zip-tied them to the arch. He didn't touch the structure itself. He didn't need to. The message was clear. But clarity did not equal peace. The next 2 nights, Trevor noticed the cameras he'd mounted near the gate had been tampered with, only slightly, angled upward by an inch, enough to obscure the road. The wiring hadn't been cut. No damage was visible. It was surgical, like someone wanted him to know they'd been there but didn't want to make a scene. He repositioned the cameras, reinforced them with locking mounts, and added 2 more, hidden inside owl decoys placed on the posts. That Friday, as the wind kicked up dust devils in the yard and the sun baked the edges of his irrigation tanks, Trevor noticed something else. His north gate, rarely used, mostly chained off, had fresh tire tracks leading up to it. Not deep ones, not recent, but there nonetheless. He hadn't used that entrance in weeks. No packages had been delivered. The only ones who would even know that gate existed were those who had been on his property before. People with maps. People with agendas. That night, he loaded the tank into the barn, secured the doors with reinforced bars, and sat on the porch with his boots propped on the railing, a notebook in his lap, and his dog, a mutt named Hal, lying beside him, ears twitching at every rustle in the weeds. He didn't feel paranoid. He felt precise. Karen had escalated, but so had he. This wasn't going to be won with a single dramatic moment. This was endurance. The following Monday, he received another letter, this time from a real estate development firm based in Scottsdale. It was a formal offer to purchase the northern 5 acres of his property, citing a generous market valuation and a mutual interest in preserving community harmony. There was no mention of Karen, but the letterhead featured a watermark that matched the same one on the trellis plaque. Trevor didn't reply. He scanned it, filed it, and added the company name to his watch list. By midweek, things shifted again. 2 county vehicles arrived unannounced, accompanied by a third-party assessor. They claimed they were conducting a routine survey for fire safety compliance related to the new vineyard expansion. Trevor, citing property rights and lack of notice, denied access and demanded documentation. The officials left, but not before one of them muttered something about non-cooperative legacy owners. Trevor caught it. He wrote it down. The language mattered. What struck him most during these days was the tone of everything. No one shouted. No one broke anything. The invasion was silent, coded in politeness, wrapped in formalities and forms. It was a campaign built not on confrontation, but attrition. Make him tired, make him question, make him a problem. Trevor didn't bite. He didn't post online. He didn't call journalists. He just reinforced the gate, ordered new signage, and began sketching the layout for a public access walking garden of native desert plants along his western fence. An open access feature that would, by law, reassert his property's original community. Utility clause and make it immune to reclassification under the Vista Rosa development plan. It was a subtle move, but it sent a message. Trevor didn't just own the land, he knew how to use it. When Monica called that Friday evening, her voice was sharper than usual. I got word through the courthouse grapevine. She's not just trying to win the civil suit. She's assembling a coalition. Her goal's broader than you think. Trevor didn't ask what she meant. He already knew. Karen didn't want to win. She wanted to erase. But if she was going to try, she'd have to do it piece by piece. Trevor intended to make every piece hurt. The weeks that followed were filled with tension so tightly coiled it was difficult to distinguish between caution and paranoia. Though Trevor had long since learned the value of acting on instincts sharpened by pattern, not panic. He continued his routine as best he could, splitting time between maintaining the property, expanding the desert garden he'd begun planting along the western fence line, and logging every incident, however minor, in a thick, spiral-bound ledger kept in his kitchen drawer. He rarely saw Karen herself during this time, but her presence could be felt in every anonymous complaint filed with the county, every vague letter about community harmony, and every unfamiliar face wandering just close enough to his boundary lines to claim innocence. It was a game of pressure and optics, but Trevor was used to long, slow wars, and this one had only just crossed its halfway mark. What changed everything came not from Karen directly, but through a single, sharp pivot in strategy that arrived in the form of an unmarked county envelope hand-delivered by a man in plain clothes who refused to identify himself. Inside were copies of a petition, one circulated through the Vista Rosa estates, arguing for a review of Trevor's land under reclassification standards for zone incompatibility and environmental deviation. In other words, they were trying to rezone him out of existence. According to the petition, Trevor's land and usage posed a visual, ecological, and acoustic disruption to the planned aesthetic environment and the future growth vision of the surrounding area. Over 100 signatures adorned the form, each one a name tied to a smiling face behind a luxury mailbox. Trevor read the document slowly, 3 times, not because he didn't understand the language, but because of what it implied. This was no longer a dispute over a vehicle or a gate or even a border. This was Karen rallying collective will to turn him into a problem not just for her, but for the entire community. If rezoning passed, his property would be subjected to entirely different standards, permitting restrictions and potential penalties. He could be forced to remove his machinery. His agricultural designation could be revoked. His desert garden could be deemed non-compliant landscaping. And, worst of all, he could lose the protections granted under the grandfather clause that had preserved his rights since long before Vista Rosa was even a thought on a blueprint. He immediately called Monica, who listened in silence before calmly asking him to bring everything to her office the next morning. She said she'd seen tactics like this before, but not usually with this level of coordination and veneer. "She's building an ecosystem of pressure," Monica said as she flipped through the petition and accompanying documents. "If this goes to hearing, and you're painted as the outlier, the board might not care about the legal history. They'll care about the narrative." Trevor leaned back in the office chair, hands folded across his chest. "Then we need to change the narrative," he said. Monica didn't smile. She never did, but she nodded once and said, "Good. Because I just got you a hearing date, and we're going to make this ugly for her." They spent the next several days preparing. Monica pulled every old filing from county records, every amendment, map, and permit that validated Trevor's rights. But more importantly, she reached out to 2 independent environmental specialists to review the property's actual ecological impact. One of them, a desert conservationist from Tucson, drove out to the ranch and walked the perimeter with Trevor, nodding approvingly at his use of native flora and rain catchment irrigation. The other, a retired planner who had once worked for the Bureau of Land Management, provided a report that directly contradicted the aesthetic and acoustic disruption claim. According to the report, Trevor's land was among the least disruptive in the area, while the vineyards across the ridge had introduced invasive species and unnatural water consumption patterns. Meanwhile, Monica filed a motion to dismiss the civil suit and submitted a formal request for the county to investigate the Vista Rosa trellis installation as a code violation, citing unpermitted construction, encroachment, and safety hazards. The tactic wasn't just about defense. It was about introducing counterpressure, creating enough institutional friction that Karen would either have to back off or reveal more of her hand. The day of the zoning review hearing arrived hot and windless, the courthouse heavy with the kind of sluggish air that makes people impatient before they even sit down. The room was modest. 3 long benches, a raised table for the board, and no cameras. Just paper, sweat, and public record. Monica insisted Trevor dress plainly, speak minimally, and avoid all commentary unless directly asked. Karen arrived in a pale blue pantsuit and 3 assistants in tow, one of whom sat near the board and handed over packets that Trevor assumed were full of highlighted buzzwords and meaningless graphs. When it was Trevor's turn to speak, he said exactly what Monica had prepared. 3 paragraphs, clear, factual, with no emotion. Then Monica stood, handed over the environmental reports, old zoning maps, and photo documentation of the trellis and vehicle incidents, and delivered a closing remark that was as quiet as it was devastating. "This is not a dispute about land," she said calmly. "It is an attempt to manufacture incompatibility by erasing the presence of someone who does not conform to a constructed narrative. But history, legality, and ecology all disagree with that narrative." Karen spoke last. She didn't rant, she didn't shout. Instead, she leaned into the board, her voice trembling in a practiced rhythm, and painted a picture of community suffering, of how Trevor's property intimidated guests, disrupted wine tastings, scared off investors. She cried, softly, about how unsafe she felt, about the noise of that vehicle and the destruction of her car. She never mentioned that the car had been illegally parked. She never needed to. That part was no longer the story. But Monica had anticipated this. She handed the board a sealed USB drive containing surveillance footage of the Lamborghini being delivered by flatbed tow days before the incident and then positioned across Trevor's gate. There was no driver, no accident. No confusion, just placement, just theater. The board didn't vote that day. They never do. But Monica said she saw it in their faces. That flicker of doubt in Karen's story. That shift from sympathy to suspicion. When Trevor returned home that evening, he sat on the porch, letting the silence reclaim its rightful place. He knew the war wasn't over. But something had shifted. The middle of the battle had come and gone. Now it was time to see who had the stamina to finish it. In the days following the county hearing, it became increasingly clear that the struggle between Trevor Nash and Karen Westbrook was evolving into something more than a boundary dispute. It was becoming a far-reaching battle of wills, one fought on multiple fronts. His legal team had won a crucial breathing space, but instead of retreating, Karen doubled down in ways that were subtle but severe, signaling she was still very much in control of the tempo and direction of this conflict. The legal documents from Monica confirmed this. Motions filed, counterclaims prepared, and evidence cataloged. But it was in the quieter, more insidious tactics where Karen's true strategy emerged. Trevor had started the week by expanding the desert garden along his western boundary as planned. Native agave, ocotillo, brittlebush, all planted in a pattern that would not only improve the soil but also serve as an ecological barrier, reinforcing his stance that his land was commitment to conservation and continuity. He dug shallow swales to collect sporadic rainwater, laid small signs labeling each plant in both Latin and English, and even mapped the layout to submit as part of his environmental report. It was precise, thoughtful work, and he felt its benefit every morning when he woke to breeze rustling through the foliage. But by midweek he noticed someone had gone through the garden at night and trampled a dozen of his carefully planted succulents, crushing their heads and leaving footprints in the moonlit soil. The footprints were from boots that had a military-style tread, a design Trevor recognized because he'd worn the same style himself in his younger days. The boots were dusty but not overly so, as if they'd been washed just before entering his land. By morning, half the garden had failed, and Trevor felt that old familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear, but focus. He photographed the devastation, measured the damage, and typed a terse message to Monica. Tonight's sabotage. Boots with military tread. Desert garden destroyed. Were escalating quietly but visibly. Monica replied shortly after, outlining next steps. They would include the sabotage in the criminal complaint for attempted destruction, request an inspection of the area for foreign substances or bait, and order additional camera coverage with infrared. She advised Trevor not to confront anyone, stressing once again that confrontation would only play into Karen's hands. Trevor nodded, though she couldn't see, every time this approach required restraint. He knew how to react with force. He knew the satisfaction of direct action. But he also knew this wasn't just a fight. It was a test of discipline. The very next night, Trevor's dormer window was shattered. A round, small but potent, almost like a shotgun wad, had been shot through the glass. The bullet hadn't gone far. It had lodged in the opposite wall of the kitchen, embedded in insulation. No one had been there. He was sure of it, because the kettle hadn't been moved from the stove and the window was locked from the inside. He took the window pane down, carefully removed the fragments, and brought the corroded round to the sheriff's ballistic unit he'd come to know from earlier inquiries. They confirmed it was buckshot, a low-velocity load, meaning it was likely meant to frighten rather than kill. "This is an intimidation shot," the deputy said. "Not a warning shot. An intimidation one. Someone wanted you to feel unsafe." Trevor wrote the number in his ledger. 1 bullet, 00 BB, night deposit on kitchen wall. Karen hadn't responded to the motion to dismiss by that point, but she issued a vague press release through local outlets, praising community safety and saying she was confident justice would prevail. The reporter who attended her staged photo op held a microphone out, then stepped back as 2 unmarked SUVs rolled slowly past in the background, their tinted windows reflecting the midday sun. Trevor saw the footage, a brief glimpse of the cars, and recognized the configuration, the same model that had been seen tailing him the night he installed the cameras. A note in his head clicked into place. This was deliberate surveillance and the kind that rarely had anything to do with fear alone. It had to mean someone was coordinating these actions. Saboteurs, detachments, maybe retired security contractors. They weren't blowing tires or stealing tools. They were psychedelic warfare without color. In response, Trevor installed motion-censored lights around the property and set up more hidden cameras. He also invested in an encrypted drive connected to the cameras, live feed, remote access, and cloud-backed storage. After midnight, he sat in his truck watching the monitors, ready to confront intruders with recorded evidence. But he remained silent. The recorder did its job. Trevor did his. 2 nights after the window incident, while checking the recordings on the truck, he spotted 2 dark silhouettes at the edge of the garden, backlit by the floodlight's wash. They were approaching the house, one of them holding what looked like a canister. With his heart pounding with the same solemn readiness he'd felt turning the tank's engine on weeks ago, Trevor exited the truck quietly, little more than a shadow in the wind. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't speak. He walked forward, camera rolling, and then the silhouettes retreated. He retrieved the canister the next morning, an 8-ounce PET bottle filled with a pink liquid. It smelled sweet. Trevor, in gloves, collected it and sent it to a local lab. It turned out to be a diluted herbicide, not strong enough to kill off the garden entirely, but enough to stunt growth. That bottle was quietly added to the criminal report. As the days turned into weeks, Karen escalated again, but now through third parties. Trevor began receiving texts on his burner phone from people claiming to be road maintenance personnel, saying his gate was causing delays and demanding he remove obstructions. He ignored them. He notified Monica, who later subpoenaed the phone logs to track their origin. A local mail drop in the estate recognized the number formatting, a prepaid burner likely traced to a company owned by Karen's shell. Evidence was quickly added to the dossier. But the true escalation came in the form of the development firm that had offered to buy his northern plot. The week after the sabotage became public, he received a detailed engineering report, the kind surveying companies only produce when serious work is planned. It included maps of easements, underground utility zones, and future pipeline corridors, some crossing his property. That report, it turned out, wasn't meant to be shared. It was leaked. The leak was attached to a community newsletter distributed to the estate residents, titled Northern Expansion Update. It painted the expansion as inevitable and framed Trevor as the lone resistor in an otherwise unified vision. The report was haphazard analysis, half downloading of risk and fear. No. It postulated possible complications if the properties were not fully consolidated and environmentally managed, including dust management, wildlife displacement, and fire control. The tone was neutral, but the implication was clear. If Trevor didn't cooperate, the burden would shift to his neighbors. Monica suggested he send a formal letter to the company, disclaiming any consent to use the data, threatening legal action for unauthorized surveys and misrepresentation. She also advised issuing a public statement to local outlets, clarifying that the expansion plan had not been approved by any property owner and that any structural or environmental studies were premature and irrelevant to his land. Trevor took both steps, concise and controlled, reinforcing his narrative without rhetoric. That Thursday, a man approached his gate at dawn, wearing a high-visibility vest and helmet, carrying a clipboard. He claimed to be conducting a hydration compliance check, whatever that meant. Trevor demanded credentials, company affiliation, permits. The man fumbled, then mumbled something about the water district. Trevor filmed the exchange, snapped photos, and told the man to leave immediately. The stranger walked off, but not before glancing back with a look Trevor recognized. Annoyance. On the gate post, he affixed a small, "No Unauthorized Personnel" placard, complete with QR code linking to county records proving no water district permits had been issued to him. That same evening, Monica called again. She'd filed criminal complaints. She'd received confirmation from county legal that the developer's report had been flagged as confidential and was now evidence in an ongoing investigation. She told Trevor to stay low, let the law do the work, and remind himself that every escalation on their side cost them resources. Their path forward would be relentless but methodical. Trevor ended the night on his porch, watching his lights flicker on across the property and the dust swirl in the floodlit ward. He touched his notebook where he wrote, Phase 2. Respond with procedure. Do not escalate physically. Use public record. Maintain clarity. His gaze drifted to the horizon where the lights from Vista Rosa glimmered faintly. A calm settled over him. But in the back of his mind he knew that what had begun as a single parked Lamborghini had grown into a campaign designed to break him. Not his land, but his resolve. But they had misjudged what he was made of. The tipping point arrived on a night so still it seemed like the desert itself had stopped breathing. Trevor had grown used to the quiet rhythms of the land. How the wind would sigh through the ocotillo after dusk. How the insects would hum beneath the stars. How even the predators seemed to respect the silence between midnight and dawn. But that night, something was different. The stillness wasn't natural. It was held, like a breath before a scream. He sat on his porch, a mug of black coffee growing cold beside him, the low drone of his perimeter sensors the only sound in the air. The tank, his old armored carrier, rested inside the barn, cleaned and silent, not as a weapon, but as a symbol now. Of resistance, of immovability, of unshakable ownership. It had become part of the land itself, a sentinel watching over the ridge. The trigger wasn't an explosion or a confrontation. It was a flash of movement caught on a corner camera, the one mounted behind the greenhouse facing the lesser-used west gate. At first, Trevor thought it was an animal, maybe a javelina or stray dog, but then the shape moved upright, deliberate, fast. He tapped the screen, zooming in. There were two figures in tactical black, moving along the fence line with military posture. They had no tools, no bags, no light, just formation and intent. One of them stopped near the boundary post and crouched, doing something with their hands. The feed was infrared, so it was hard to tell, but Trevor leaned forward and saw the small, subtle movement of a drill. They were modifying the post, probably placing a device, maybe a tracker, maybe something worse. Trevor didn't grab a weapon. He didn't move toward confrontation. He reached for his phone and dialed Monica directly, not the local sheriff. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm but alert. He explained what he was seeing in concise detail, no speculation. She listened, then said, "Do not go outside. Lock down. I'll trigger the private investigator and county contact." Monica had anticipated something like this and retained a private surveillance firm just in case. Tonight, that bet would pay off. Within 20 minutes, the investigator, a former field agent turned private sector counter-surveillance operator, arrived quietly in an unmarked truck, parked a mile away, and moved in on foot. His footage, captured from a ridge, showed the same two figures now exiting through the brush, one of them carrying what appeared to be a tablet or sensor device. They vanished into the darkness, leaving no trace, except for what the investigator found the next morning, a tampered boundary post containing a GPS node with a timed battery and uplink capacity. It wasn't just monitoring. It was mapping. Monica, upon receiving the report, moved fast. She compiled the footage, the recovered node, and the investigator's statement into a sealed file, which she submitted both to county officials and the FBI's field office, noting that the device had unauthorized communication capability and that its placement violated multiple property and federal communications laws. It was no longer just harassment. It had become criminal. 2 days later, Karen appeared in public again, this time giving a prepared statement at a local planning commission review, promoting future growth harmony and claiming continued harassment by aggressive legacy property holders was undermining the safety and cohesion of the Vista Rosa community. Her speech was theatrical, measured, and vaguely accusatory without naming Trevor, but the implications were loud. She spoke of militarized intimidation, of vehicles built for war parked like monuments of fear, and of neighbors who refused to evolve. Monica called Trevor the moment the clip aired on a local affiliate, her tone clipped and sharp. That was a calculated provocation. She wants to provoke a response, any response, so she can recast the narrative as her being under siege. Don't take the bait. Trevor didn't need the warning. He had already disconnected the tank's starter coil and chained the barn shut from the inside. It wasn't a prop, it wasn't a threat, but it had served its purpose. Now it was a liability Karen intended to reframe. The final move came when a group of Wine Estate residents, 8 in total, filed a coordinated petition to restrict Trevor's access road, citing noise pollution, traffic disruption, and visual discord. The petition called for the county to seize Trevor's access strip under eminent domain and incorporate it into a proposed vineyard expansion plan. It was a bold move, aggressive, transparent, and based entirely on the presumption that Trevor would fold under public and financial pressure. They didn't anticipate what Monica had prepared. She responded with a 30-page rebuttal that included historic maps, private deed records, a land use analysis by a geospatial engineer, and 3 sworn affidavits from long-term residents affirming that the road had been in Trevor's family for over 50 years and that no public funds had ever maintained it. She also presented evidence of tampering, surveillance, and interference, leading the county to delay the hearing indefinitely pending review. At the same time, she filed an injunction freezing all development permits linked to Vista Rosa until the criminal investigation into property interference was resolved. Karen had not expected this level of precision. She had expected resistance, but not organization. She had expected anger, but not restraint. Her strategy had relied on emotional reaction, hoping Trevor would snap, make a threat, confront someone physically. But instead, he had documented, waited, restrained himself, and now the story was turning. The press, long skeptical, began shifting. A small blog, run by a retired legal analyst who had once written op-eds on property law, published an in-depth article titled Gentrification or Harassment: The Curious Case of Nash versus the Estates. It broke down the zoning history, the surveillance footage, and the pattern of provocations. The piece was picked up by 2 larger outlets within days. Suddenly, Trevor wasn't just a recluse with a tank. He was a property owner defending generational land from a calculated multi-party campaign to erase him through lawfare and optics. Trevor read the article once, then put it away. He didn't need validation. He needed closure. That evening, as the heat rose from the canyon floor and cicadas buzzed in the shadows, he stood at the edge of his property where the trellis had once stood. The structure had been quietly dismantled by order of the county, deemed unsafe and illegally placed. In its place, Trevor erected a simple arch of driftwood and steel, bearing a sign that read, "Boundary respected, peace maintained." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of endurance. He turned toward the house as the lights flicked on one by one, not by motion sensor but by his own hand. Control, after all, was something he never surrendered. Not to fear, not to force, and certainly not to someone like Karen. By the time the final notices were delivered, the air had shifted, not just on Trevor's land but across the entire ridge. The aggressive momentum that Karen had cultivated for months had begun to lose its force, not because of some spectacular collapse, but because the foundation she'd built her campaign on had started to rot quietly from within. County officials, no longer eager to align themselves with her version of events, had begun to delay meetings, cancel permit evaluations, and respond with carefully non-committal language. Her allies in the Planning Commission suddenly found themselves burdened with scrutiny, their prior communications subject to open record requests Monica had filed in a cluster, timed to hit just as local elections neared. And within Vista Rosa itself, the community that once stood behind her with uniform enthusiasm began to splinter. Some residents, particularly those newer to the development, started to voice concerns, low at first, then in letters, then in local forums, about the increasingly hostile tone of their neighborhood leadership and the questionable use of legal threats to resolve what many now saw as a personal vendetta against a man who had simply refused to conform. Trevor had spent much of the final month tying up his preparations quietly. He refiled his land use protections with updated geospatial data, transferred ownership of the property into a trust for future proofing, and expanded his surveillance archive to create a complete, time-stamped record of every attempt at coercion, trespass, or tampering. He built a steel-framed shed near the north gate, not for storage but to house an auxiliary power system and data backup node in case things escalated in the future. Each step he took was deliberate, calm, without announcement. There would be no dramatic counterattack, no sweeping moment of revenge. Trevor had already won in the only way that mattered, by remaining. The news came through Monica, as always, clinical, efficient. The civil suit had been dismissed with prejudice. The criminal investigation into the surveillance node had been quietly closed but not forgotten. Internal findings had been inconclusive, but a quiet settlement offer had been extended to Trevor in exchange for withdrawing his ongoing complaint. He declined. Monica advised him it was a symbolic gesture anyway, meant to keep the issue out of headlines, not to offer restitution. Karen, for her part, had resigned from the Community Development Board and taken an extended sabbatical to Europe, according to a statewide communication. No public apology, no retraction, just absence. Trevor didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. The final phase of something like this isn't loud. It's silence returning, a long and gradual exhale. The property grew quieter in the days that followed. No more unfamiliar cars hovered near the gates, no flyers, no inspectors, just the occasional neighbor nodding from afar, the same neighbors who once wouldn't have looked him in the eye. On the last Sunday of the season, he stood again at the western fence, staring at the now mature garden that had once been trampled and poisoned but had recovered. The agave had rebounded, stronger than before, and the ocotillo had bloomed red against the pale sky. Birds moved freely through the branches. The soil was darker, denser, healthier. Life, Trevor thought, doesn't care about narratives. It only knows whether it can grow or not. He didn't dismantle the cameras. He didn't remove the motion lights. He simply adjusted them, changed their sensitivity, scaled them down. Not out of fear, but out of habit. Vigilance wasn't the same as paranoia. And, though the legal threat had passed, Trevor knew full well that in places like this where land meets power, victories are never absolute. There are always more Karens, more plans dressed in smiles and paperwork, more quiet battles waiting to begin. But when the dust settles, it's the ones who know how to stand still that remain. And Trevor Nash, for all his silence, all his restraint, had stood through every storm they tried to conjure. Without flinching, without bending, and without leaving.